reality. So a possible world in this context is not a planet or a universe or any kind of concrete object. It's just a world description. The actual world is the description that is true. Other possible worlds are descriptions which are not in fact true, but which might have been true. To say that something exists in a possible world is to say that there is some description of reality which includes that entity as part of the description. To say that something exists in every possible world means that no matter which description is true, that entity will be included in the description. So, for example, unicorns do not in fact exist, but there is some possible world in which unicorns exist. On the other hand, many mathematicians think that numbers, for example, exist in every possible world. Now, with that in mind, consider the ontological argument, which was discovered in 1011 by the monk Anselm of Canterbury. God, Anselm observes, is by definition the greatest conceivable being. If you could conceive of anything greater than God, then that would be God. Thus, by definition, God is the greatest conceivable being, a maximally great being. So, what would such a being be like? Well, he would be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, and he would exist in every logically possible world. A being which lacked any of those properties would not be maximally great. We could conceive of something greater. But what that implies is that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. For if a maximally great being exists in any possible world, he exists in all of them. That's part of what it means to be maximally great, to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every logically possible world. So if God's existence is even possible, then he exists in every logically possible world, and therefore in the actual world. Now we can summarize this argument as follows. Premise 1, it is possible that a maximally great being, aka God, exists. 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists. 7, therefore, God exists. Now, it might surprise you to learn that steps 2 to 7 of this argument are relatively uncontroversial. Most philosophers would agree that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows that God must exist. So the whole question devolves to premise 1. Is God's existence possible? Well, what do you think? The atheist has to maintain that it's impossible that God exists. He has to say that the concept of God is incoherent, like the concept of a married bachelor or a round square. But the problem is that the concept of God just doesn't appear to be incoherent in that way. The idea of a being which is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good in every logically possible world seems perfectly coherent. Moreover, as we've seen already tonight, there are other arguments for God's existence that I've shared, which at least suggest that it's possible that God exists. So I'll simply leave the ball in your court. Do you think, as I do, that it's possible at least that God exists? If so, then it follows logically that he does exist. 6, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, was a remarkable individual. New Testament critics have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unprecedented sense of divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. That's why the Jewish leadership instigated his crucifixion on the charge of blasphemy. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come. And as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then it would seem that we have a divine miracle on our hands and hence evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But there are actually three established facts recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus: his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Let me just say a brief word about each one of these. Fact number one: Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in this area, and I quote, "By far most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb." According to the critic D.H. Van Dalen, it is extremely difficult to object to the empty tomb on historical grounds. He says those who deny it do so on the basis of theological or philosophical assumptions. Fact number two: on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to Gerhard Ludemann, a prominent German New Testament critic, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by unbelievers, skeptics, and even enemies. Fact number three: the original disciples suddenly came to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. Second, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. Luke Johnson, who is a New Testament scholar at Emory University, states, "Some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was." And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, "That is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him."